All right, so I wanted to kind of quickly go over Konga, which is sort of a dashboard-like application that you can install. It's node-based, sits on top of Kong. If you think of Kong as sort of this Nginx plugin system that you can sort of install with Postgres connections, and Konga is kind of like the node application that you can use to sort of manage that service and manage all of those different features. Currently, we manage Kong through our YAML files and through config, and we version control all the changes that we make to it and that kind of thing. This would allow us to basically hand over that configuration and control to a lot of the non-developers on the team, just for more of a customer service approach to API connectivity, and obviously this is an open source application, so there's a lot we can do in terms of forking, in terms of adding features and functionalities and so forth. So I'll give a quick breakdown of Konga and its different features. This is the primary dashboard. As you can see here, I've got Kong installed locally on my machine, and then I'm just running an instance of Konga that's attached to my local Kong. My local Kong actually has all of our development configuration settings installed specifically so that I can kind of show you what this would look like in a development environment setting, but also to give you an idea of what the use case looks like for production and so forth. So as you can see here, this is sort of the dashboard. It tells you how many API items are being requested, writing, waiting, etc., timers, pendings. A lot of this stuff I can see as things that two active users, in this case those two users are me, but I can see a lot of this dashboard stuff being sort of the kind of stuff that I think Alex had said he wanted with regards to being able to track API usage and so forth. And then if I go into the gateway settings here, you can kind of see everything is just kind of a visual representation of a lot of the requests and a lot of the API endpoints that we already make on the back end to Kong. So you can see here kind of a breakdown of all of our global installed plugins, taglines, all that kind of stuff. Most of this is administrative related. Services, sort of the ability to add and remove services, API services specifically, directly in the API or in the dashboard is sort of an interesting appeal here. Obviously, we wouldn't do that right away, but you get the idea here in terms of like being able to break down the service, write it all up, change connectivity times, all that kind of stuff, as well as being able to make changes, add plugins, change routes information, all of that, all the stuff that we as developers do. I can see a world where we can potentially start doing a lot of this kind of stuff, start handing a lot of this kind of stuff over to the non-development sort of customer service, customer facing side of things, like a Zach and so forth on the VA side. And so this kind of breaks down what all the different services are in the system and what's available, and we can add to them, we can delete them, we can clean them up, and so forth. And then in terms of routes, you can kind of see here how the routes work. Setting up route IDs, route validations. You can sort of get a handle for how a lot of these are configured. Like I said, this is all stuff that we as developers on the Kong side are familiar with because this is the stuff that we're feeding into the YAML files for config, but you can kind of see how for a lot of this stuff, when you're talking about being able to add an additional plugin, a security plugin, traffic control, serverless plugin, whatever, logging plugin to a particular endpoint, being able to offload a lot of these features and all of this functionality to non-devs on the team, I think is a truly sort of scalable implementation of the system. Here, sort of a breakdown of APIs. We don't really have any of these yet in our implementation, mostly because it's been depreciated. But you can kind of see how it used to work with regards to APIs versus services. Consumers is sort of the area that I really wanted to sort of dig into and talk about, because in this case, part of my RFC is discussing the idea of making VSOs the actual consumers of the APIs versus the software vendors. A big part of our requirements with regards to the benefits platform has to do with making sure that we restrict access to certain veterans and to certain veteran information based off of the VSO, not necessarily based off a vendor. If a VSO has a power of attorney, say on a veteran, we need to be able to restrict access to that VSO only to the veterans that they have power of attorney access for, and so forth. And so part of this sort of approach would be to be able to create consumers. In this case, you'd have a custom ID, which would potentially be the POA VSO code ID that's in the Corp DB right now, and then potentially a username for that particular VSO. And then off of that data, essentially, just like we have with VetsPro and with other providers right now, we could basically add them to, say, a group. We can create a group of VSOs to be able to manage them and hand that management over to a non-developer to be able to handle. We can basically create our own key system with regards to being able to generate keys for the VSOs right away. So instead of a developer having to generate a bunch of keys to send over to somebody, you could have somebody like a Lenora or a Zach on the phone with the VSOs, creating and generating their keys right then and there on the spot, and so forth. You kind of get the idea. Restricting API accessible plugins or accessible APIs which are depreciated, which we won't be using. Accessible services, which basically just limiting the services that the VSOs would be allowed to interact with and be granted permission for. As you can kind of get an idea here, accessible routes with regards to the different routes that they'll have access to, and then obviously plugins, which would be by default the global, unless there's something specific we want to set up for a particular VSO. But the idea here basically being that we can view sort of the defaults for a lot of this stuff and be able to grant access and deny access based off of everything from, if a VSO, for example, gives a software vendor a new credential. So say a VSO has multiple software vendors and they want to give a different API key for each software vendor. Say there's a problem in the relationship with that vendor, there's been a security breach, something has happened, or whatever the case is, we'll be able to pull that particular software vendor's VSO license key without necessarily impacting the VSO's other vendors and other services. And that's kind of the approach that I'm trying to go here by using something like Konga to sort of offload a lot of this thought process, a lot of this functionality from what is currently a developer-centric approach and using config to more of a non-development user, more of a customer service API approach for other folks to be able to generate keys and generate consumer accounts and grant access and that kind of thing. And I think this is a sort of breakdown of plugins. Again, a lot of this stuff we can sort of set up based off of user access. So I can imagine a world where somebody like Zach or somebody like Nora might have consumer access level, but not necessarily plugin or upstream access level or certificate level, that kind of thing. Currently, I'm just kind of showing you the default across the board for all of them. And then in terms of adding new plugins and everything else, it's super easy to be able to turn things on and turn things off without necessarily implementing too much of a deploy scheme. Then creating upstreams, I believe, are part of the upstream service for Kong, and then obviously certificates for getting access HTTPS access to other systems and so forth. The way, in terms of Konga itself, the application has an internal user system which relies on Kong's own Postgres connectivity to be able to create users and add users and so forth. So it's all sort of baked in. I didn't have to set anything up. It just sort of generated the local storage itself. But you can basically see a world where again, this is open source software. This is completely freely available to use and to modify as we wish. I can see a world where instead of necessarily tying to a local DB, we basically potentially connect this to an LDAP system. This would be super easy to do, and essentially tie it into our current LDAP or whatever the VA is using for LDAP and authenticity, so that a Zach could basically use his PIV card to be able to log in as a specific user with specific rights and access rights and that kind of thing, as an editor or whatever the case is. Connective connections, these are just the different Kong connections that we have access to. In this case, as you can see here, I'm just connecting it to my local Kong. The real sort of interesting part of this, and this snapshots became sort of the way that I think we can move forward with implementing Konga and still maintaining sort of our version control process that's currently in place right now with Config. What snapshots allows us to do is it allows us to take hourly, daily snapshots of our entire Kong implementation or Kong stuff, basically. And if there's a problem, if there's an issue, if somebody accidentally changes something that they shouldn't have or whatever shouldn't have changed, or whatever the case is, we can basically roll back to a previous snapshot. And that's kind of really powerful in the sense that it's basically RDS style snapshotting of Kong state within a dashboard application. So not necessarily me or Patrick having to go in there and resetting from scratch, but somebody more like a Zach or Lenore or whoever, basically adding snapshots of any multiple array of configurations. And you can see here, adding a schedule is not that hard to do. In terms of listing snapshots, taking it into the snapshot, importing a snapshot, that kind of thing. Super easy to implement, super easy to sort of set up. Settings, there's basically just basic node type settings for email activation and all sorts of other stuff. I hope this kind of helped explain a little bit of how Konga works and how it can be really useful for us. Again, if you get a chance, read through the RFC that I wrote about implementing this to kind of get an idea. I didn't go too in depth in terms of the different features that's in the actual application, because I wasn't even sure if Konga would be on the table with regards to the VA, but I think it's an application worth considering for the future of our Kong API implementation, primarily for the purpose of the fact that, hey, we can basically take this and really implement it in a way that allows the non-development users on the team to participate more in terms of like the security aspect of adding new APIs, adding new consumers, adding new access points, allowing folks to grant keys, revoke keys when there's a security issue or whatever the case is. I think a lot of this stuff can definitely be moved off of the developers' plates and onto more of a customer service style pattern. That's all I've got, and I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you. Bye.